Hi, I'm Annie. A few years ago, I started writing in my blog, Al Día Fem, when I noticed a puzzling shift in Argentina. Policies and movements, once focused on women's rights, increasingly prioritize identity politics. This discovery drove me to research how this ideology became a powerful institution, a journey I've captured in my book, The Institution of Gender, which I will introduce later. Today, first, I'll share three key examples of how transactivism has taken root in Argentina, reshaping our society. In the province of Chaco, the Superior Court of Justice passed a regulation in September 2025 allowing travestites, transsexuals, and transgender individuals to apply to administrative roles in the judiciary. A separate hiring process and exam will be created. The resolution aims to promote equal opportunity and address historical inequalities, in line with Argentina's constitutional and international treaty obligations. This is the judiciary hiring policy. Let's examine the implications of Chaco's new policy. First, Argentina's 2012 gender identity law establishes the primary legal foundation for gender identity rights. However, authorities mislead the public by claiming international treaties bind Argentina to implement such policies, which is incorrect. Many treaties, like the non-binding Yoga Carta principles, lack legal force. Yet, this framing manipulates public understanding of Argentina's obligations, creating a false sense of necessity for these measures. Second, what legal or policy factors influence Chaco's decision to hire individuals who reject their sex? I argue that gender identity ideology has captured the public system, erasing sex distinctions. This raises concerns about whether ideology overshadows practical governance in shaping these policies. Third, employees both reinforce social pressures behind gender-focused policies. The judiciary argues that including these individuals adds diverse perspectives, strengthening administrative roles in the justice system. However, some question how these policies balance inclusivity with merit-based hiring and the preservation of sex-based women's rights in the public justice system. And one more thing, this province faces some of the toughest challenges in the country when it comes to poverty and malnutrition. Nearly half of the people live below the poverty line, making it one of the poorest regions. Identity politics has successfully captured institutions, undermining the traditional center-left class struggle. The shift is particularly evident in one of the most progressive provinces for the LGBT community. Let me share something about my country. Argentina National Women's Meetings, ENM, started in 1986, were grassroots, self-funded and independent gatherings. Women united yearly, free from government and political party influence, to discuss women's issues, share ideas, and build solidarity in feminist principles, horizontal, autonomous, and free from institutions. These meetings grew into powerful platforms for feminist activism and policy change, with thousands attending, often self-funding through collective efforts. But recently, the ENM has changed, now called the Plurinational Meeting of Women and Diversities. In 2019, it includes LGBTQ+ groups, reflecting a focus on identity politics. The shift allows men identifying as women to participate, backed by political parties, labor unions, and global advocacy networks. This gathering now relies on funding from governments, unions, and other groups, eroding its grassroots spirit. A coalition of national and international interest groups have co-opted the movement, pushing for the inclusion of men identifying as women. As a result, many women's organizations aligning with this identitarian agenda increasingly marginalized feminists prioritizing sex-based rights, weakening the advocacy for women's original concerns. Let's go with the last example, the city of Buenos Aires. This city is a political, economic, educational, and cultural center of a country. Nowadays, it has multiple administrative areas actively incorporating a gender perspective, demonstrating a comprehensive commitment beyond just data measurement. Key entities include Gender Equality Secretariat, Ministry of Education, which implements comprehensive sexual education, inclusive and diverse school environments, Ministry of Health provides medical intervention for individuals seeking to alter their sex characteristics. Ministry of Justice and Security, Labor Secretariat, Social Assistance Department, Urban Planning Area. By extensively integrating gender ideology, women's public sector demonstrate how deeply the identitarian agenda reshapes governance, as seen in Chakyo. Employees, job security, and financial stability are closely tied to their commitment to this agenda. This connection incentivizes them to perpetuate it as an ongoing, self-sustaining goal. In turn, politicians boost their votes and popularity by advocating for trans humans' rights. This support allows them to secure substantial public funding for this agenda with minimal scrutiny or criticism. I've introduced these three illustrative examples to explore what the architecture of a progressive, queer state looks like today. One example is how the justice system upholds gender identity-based rights. Another is how women's grassroots civil society movement gets swallowed up by identity politics and manipulated by its own interest groups. And finally, how a city's public administration embeds the gender agenda across all these sectors. These examples show how this agenda undermines women's rights while enforcing a worldview that punishes dissent. We know this identity agenda is a coercive ideology, one that compels others to deny reality, offering professional or social rewards for affirming gender identities while imposing penalties such as exclusion or censorship on those who don't. This social capture is what I call the institution of gender, and it succeeds through a slow, almost imperceptible infiltration into culture, progressive political forces, and public institutions, driven by a massive campaign on propaganda and political influence. Argentina exemplifies a unique case where historical and political factors had advanced the institutionalization of gender identity. This has created a vast industry, benefiting professions like medicine and psychology, while establishing an extensive public system framed as a human right. This institution of gender is a multifaceted, highly profitable business. A key condition for its growth is capturing the state and public administration from within. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sustainable or able to keep expanding. This was achieved through a coalition of various groups, international and national interest groups. Argentina's political and academic elites actively collaborate with influential international organizations to advance shared agendas. These include prominent bodies like the United Nations and its agencies, like the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and others, which provide expertise, the know-how, and funding to shape policies on issues like public health, sexual education, and social equity. Concurrently, within Argentina, universities serve as intellectual hubs, fostering research and advocacy. Professional associations, including those for doctors and educators, integrate these priorities into their work. Activist groups and NGOs amplify these efforts, engaging communities to drive social, political, and cultural change across all levels of Argentine society. This coalition turned gender identity into a lucrative enterprise, not only creating a thriving industry, but also expanding a massive state apparatus to support it. One clear source of power comes from a public health system. Advocates have created and expanded a business to address something they claim isn't a disease, yet requires medical support and respect. Unlike wealthy northern countries, where self-perception-based healthcare is mostly private, in third world nations, the costs largely fall in the public healthcare system, though not exclusively, draining citizens' resources to align with global identity agendas. Beyond the healthcare business, a second source of power uses human rights rhetoric to justify bureaucratic expansion. This flow of power, privilege, and money come from leveraging public administration to ensure social for individuals who claim to be a different sex, arguing that government must protect and defend the human rights of these minorities. By framing gender identity as a human right, politicians and bureaucrats have built a vast public system, secretariats, offices, and programs, employing thousands to promote this agenda. How was this achieved? As I argued, the current gender architecture stems from a coalition of national and international interest groups pushing identity politics into Argentina's public administrations through various means, as explored in my book. This agenda likely began in the 80s, 90s with various strategies, mechanisms, and micro-movements as they have been replicated across the globe. Let me give you one example. It began slowly and subtly introducing identity language in the public health system, without any definition and public discussion about it. First, in the 90s, the National Health Ministry's National Health Program on AIDS, HIV, aimed to treat and prevent HIV transmission. During this period, government officials began replacing sex-based categories in official documents and statistics with terms like trans, trabas, and travestis without clear definitions or public debate. Why were sexes erased from official documents in this process? Secondly, the government also set up inclusive health services with international support and funds, such as UNAIDS and World Health Organization. Additionally, these were health services for people with AIDS, but they also started to provide hormonal treatments for people rejecting their biological sex. Consider the role of a national interest groups in this example. A prominent non-governmental organization called Fundación Huésped works in coalition with the national government and UNAIDS. It's a government and UN-funded NGO focused on HIV/AIDS. Furthermore, the NGO mission included spreading identity-based terminology in mass media. They work together to legitimize the idea that men can identify as women and vice versa, despite that biological sex cannot be changed. In other words, this NGO was pushing political correctness in the healthcare services. Moreover, the same NGO also published reports evaluating government performance to pressure the national government to advocate for improved gender health services. In addition to that, quietly, National and Provincial Health Care Services establishes guidelines to register patients' names based on their perceived identity. The public services recognized them in their chosen names, despite lacking legal basis at the time. In other words, Argentina enacted its 2012 self-ID law, allowing individuals to change their legal gender without medical and judicial approval after these earlier developments. But before that, the government actively promoted and legitimized sex and name changes. It also pressured people to modify their speech to align with self-identified genders. Concurrently, governments trained healthcare professionals and workers to provide medical treatments for individuals based on their self-identified gender. Finally, the national government fully implemented social pressure to align speech with self-identified genders across all its communications. Provinces, public agencies, higher education institutions, and other related entities obviously adopted this policy. This coalition of groups that aim to institutionalize gender identity in the whole public system share the same trait. They are coming from the same political origins. A left leaving the fight for the economic inequality to identify politics. These findings and much more are examined in my book. Is how the public administration got queer and set up a huge business with gender identity. My book is called The Institution of Gender, Denial of Sex as Profitable Business. Thank you for listening and for engaging in my work.